Israel has intensified its airstrikes on Gaza, leading to tragic civilian casualties, including 6 United Nations staff members. The escalation in the region is adding a new chapter to an already long-standing conflict, leaving the international community in shock. This video will break down the latest developments, including key figures and the political ramifications of these airstrikes. Stay with us as we examine the ongoing crisis in detail. For decades, the Israel-Gaza conflict has been one of the world's most persistent and devastating disputes. What started as territorial and political disagreements between Israel and Palestine has now morphed into a full-blown humanitarian crisis. Gaza, a densely populated strip of land home to over 2 million Palestinians, has been subject to military blockades and recurrent violence, largely from Israeli airstrikes and retaliatory attacks from Hamas. In the latest wave of violence, Israeli airstrikes in Gaza have led to the deaths of 6 United Nations staff members. According to UNRWA, the United Nations agency that oversees humanitarian efforts in Gaza, their staff members were providing critical aid when they were caught in the crossfire. Israel maintains that its airstrikes were aimed at neutralizing Hamas militants, but the loss of civilian life, particularly UN workers, has drawn sharp criticism from the international community. These airstrikes have triggered a significant political fallout. The United Nations Secretary-General, Antonio Guterres, condemned the loss of life and urged Israel to respect international humanitarian law, especially in areas with civilian populations and aid workers. The European Union has also called for restraint, emphasizing the need for a two-state solution as the only long-term peace option. Meanwhile, Israel claims its actions are in self-defense, asserting that Hamas continues to use civilian infrastructure to shield military operations, thus making airstrikes inevitable. Beyond the deaths of UN workers, the situation in Gaza remains dire for civilians. The healthcare system is under immense pressure, with hospitals overwhelmed by the influx of injured civilians. Many have been forced to seek shelter in makeshift bunkers, schools, and UN facilities. According to health authorities in Gaza, the civilian death toll continues to rise, with hundreds more wounded. Humanitarian agencies warn of an impending catastrophe if aid supplies are further restricted. Humanitarian agencies are scrambling to provide aid, but the blockade on Gaza has made it increasingly difficult to transport essential supplies. UNRWA has highlighted that food, medicine, and clean water are becoming scarce, and with the destruction of key infrastructure, the crisis could deepen further. The World Health Organization has already flagged Gaza's situation as an emergency, with children, women, and the elderly being the most vulnerable. In response to these airstrikes, Hamas has issued statements accusing Israel of war crimes while vowing retaliation. The militant group has launched rocket barrages towards southern Israel, which has led to air raid sirens and temporary evacuations in Israeli towns near Gaza. While Israel's Iron Dome defense system has intercepted most of these rockets, the escalation has sparked fears of an all-out war. International reactions to the airstrikes and the broader conflict have been divided. Countries like the United States have reiterated their support for Israel's right to self-defense, but have called for proportional responses to limit civilian casualties. Meanwhile, protests have erupted in various cities around the world, with demonstrators calling for an end to the violence and expressing solidarity with the Palestinian people. Notably, countries like Turkey and Iran have condemned Israel's actions, labeling them as acts of aggression. The implications of this ongoing conflict stretch far beyond the Middle East. Israel's actions, coupled with Hamas's retaliation, have the potential to destabilize the region even further. With both sides unwilling to back down, the international community is concerned about the broader geopolitical consequences. Countries in the region like Egypt and Jordan have called for immediate ceasefires to avoid a humanitarian disaster. Meanwhile, global powers like Russia and China are using the situation to criticize Western intervention, highlighting the complexities of international diplomacy. To fully understand the severity of the current situation, it's essential to look at the history of the Israel-Palestine conflict. Since the mid-20th century, the region has been plagued by territorial disputes, forced displacements, and violent clashes. Gaza, in particular, has been a focal point of the conflict. Over the years, multiple ceasefires have been agreed upon, only to be broken as tensions flare up repeatedly. The blockade imposed by Israel on Gaza since 2007 has further exacerbated the humanitarian crisis, with recurring cycles of violence becoming the norm. Public opinion on the conflict remains polarized. Social media platforms are filled with both pro-Israel and pro-Palestine sentiments. While some argue that Israel has the right to defend itself from terrorist threats, others condemn the disproportionate use of force, especially when civilian casualties are involved. The debate is also taking place in political circles, with lawmakers across the globe divided on how best to respond to the crisis. As the situation continues to develop, all eyes are on whether international diplomatic efforts can successfully de-escalate the conflict. Both sides remain entrenched in their positions, but there are growing calls for renewed peace talks. The question remains, can diplomacy succeed where violence has failed? Or is the region doomed to face yet another round of destruction and loss? As this humanitarian crisis unfolds, it's critical that international aid continues to flow into Gaza to assist those affected by the violence. Organizations like the UN, Red Cross, and other non-governmental organizations are working tirelessly to provide shelter, food, and medical care. If you're looking for ways to help, consider donating to recognized humanitarian organizations on the ground. The situation in Gaza is complex and deeply rooted in decades of conflict, but the human toll continues to rise. Civilian lives lost, including UN workers, serve as a reminder of the price being paid for this unending conflict.